Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm here today at the time when we are facing terrible convergence of humanitarian crisis around the world. The appalling displacement and suffering caused by the fighting in Gaza, in Syria, the struggle to contain Ebola virus spreading in West Africa, the dramatic humanitarian situation in South Sudan and in the Central African Republic. And here in Europe, as you know, deteriorating situation in eastern Ukraine. Yesterday, President Barroso was on the phone with the President of Ukraine, Mr. Poroshenko, and the President of Russia, Mr. Putin, exactly for the reason of discussing how we can find a way forward. On the humanitarian side, we are finalizing an emergency decision of 2.5 million euros, humanitarian assistance for the affected populations in eastern Ukraine, and also to support the Ukrainian authorities to upgrade their humanitarian response capacity. Also, at home in Europe, we have dealt with forest fires in Sweden, first ever need of Sweden to receive assistance to deal with forest fires, as well as with floods in the Balkans, in Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and my own country, Bulgaria. But right now, the most urgent crisis, and the main reason I am with you today, is in Iraq. A crisis that is now debated by the United Nations whether it should be upgraded to level 3 emergency, the highest level that UN humanitarian organizations declare. And if that is to happen, we will be coping with 4 level 3 emergencies at the same time: Syria, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and now possibly also Iraq. A very sobering reminder that our world is becoming more fragile than ever before. You have been following up the deterioration in Iraq, horrible impact on civilians, hundreds of thousands of people forced out of their homes by the fighting in the north. For many of them, this is the second time they have been made homeless. To help them survive, we are increasing our humanitarian aid to Iraq by additional 5 million euros, boosting our assistance for this year to 17 million euros. I just want to remind you that in June we have added 5 million euros when it was already clear that the needs are growing. The new funding is to help hundreds of thousands of vulnerable Iraqis, including minority groups that have been besieged in the mountains of Sinjar. We will be providing emergency assistance to displaced populations, but also to very vulnerable host communities, poor communities that have to cope with this inflow of internally displaced people. When I visited Baghdad and the Kurdish region of Iraq in March this year, it was already very clear that a massive humanitarian crisis is looming. At that time, it was mostly in the Anbar province of Iraq. We made a decision to not only increase financing, but to set up an office in Erbil. And I can tell you that today this decision is paying off because it allows us to very quickly increase and direct assistance to affected populations. And let's not forget that the Kurdish region of Iraq is also hosting Syrian refugees, over 230,000 people, and they need help for that as well. I pray that this horrible circle of violence would end, that this crisis will find, in the end, a peaceful resolution. But even if weapons were to be laid down tomorrow, the humanitarian needs would remain massive in Iraq, in Syria, in Gaza, in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic. So humanitarians will remain very busy. On the 19th of August is World Humanitarian Day, so please spare a thought for the people who risk their lives to save the lives of others. The crisis in Iraq is just the latest reminder of how crucial their work is and how much they need us to support them. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just to remind you very briefly before we go to questions that we have press releases on both the support for Iraq and the support for Ukraine available. And I see the first question from the lady here in the blue shirt.
It's Dorota from Polish TV Polsat. Commissioner, I would like to ask you for your reaction to the Russian convoy that is on the way with so-called humanitarian help together with International Red Cross to Ukraine. What do you think about this decision by the Russian Federation?
It is very important that delivery of humanitarian aid anywhere by anyone complies with the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and that international humanitarian organizations are those who, exactly in compliance with their mandate and the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence, are to help people affected by crisis. It is an issue that has been very seriously discussed in the last days, and very clearly the position taken is that the sovereignty of Ukraine must be respected and the neutrality, impartiality, and independence of delivery of humanitarian aid must be protected. What we understand is that indeed there is a convoy of humanitarian assistance assembled, but it would be days before it is to come to the Ukrainian border, and then it has to be cleared by Ukrainian authorities, and then it must be delivered in a way that strictly and solely pursues the assistance of affected populations and no any other objectives.
The follow-up, there's no more follow-up? That took care of it? Or sorry, you had your hand up, so.
Because at the moment the Red Cross cannot guarantee what exactly is in these trucks.
This is exactly the issue that has to be very clearly established, that the content of humanitarian aid must be exactly that, humanitarian aid, and obviously cannot be taken on face value. So how exactly the delivery would take place will be discussed in the next day. So I cannot comment more than that, because this is where we are at the moment. All I can say is that not just for the people in eastern Ukraine, for the ability of humanitarian workers to deliver assistance to affected populations, it always has to be done with respect and in accordance with the principles of neutrality, impartiality, independence. No political or any other objectives must be pursued. And that I'm saying, look, I mean, on the 19th of August, on World Humanitarian Day, we will think of the 450 humanitarian workers who just this year were killed or wounded or kidnapped. Their job is becoming increasingly difficult. In Iraq, it is so excruciatingly difficult to help people today because we have allowed these principles to be eroded. And I do not think that in Europe you would find any one of us to be willing to accept further erosion of this, to accept any erosion of these principles for the sake of humanity.
Thank you. Next question was here, and then we'll come to the next one.
Nawab Khan from the Kuwait news agency Kuna. Commissioner, you said that the UN is discussing to raise the emergency level on Iraq humanitarian aid. What is the EU position on this? And my second question is on Gaza. Are you thinking of increasing the humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people in Gaza? Thank you.
Thank you for these two questions. On the first question, it is a responsibility of the United Nations to decide on the level of emergency, whether it is 2 or 3. And for the EU, what we do is, according to the level established, we revisit our funding decisions, our deployment of our own staff in zones of severe emergency, and it is an indication of priority. But let me say that with 3 already level 3 emergencies, and this possibly, very likely being a 4th one, the pressure on humanitarian workers, on the humanitarian community, is going very fast, very far. And that requires for all of us not only to mobilize more money, but to support humanitarians to have access to deliver aid. Because money means nothing to the families strangled in a place where there is no access, because extremists are not providing access to them, because fighting is so intensive that humanitarians cannot reach out to these people. And this is why mobilization of the international community today in support of access to those in need is so very critical. And let me just make one more point. In 2000, in year 2000, the global funding for humanitarian aid was $2 billion. This year, 2014, already in July, it exceeded $10 billion. And yet, we fall behind the needs. We are short in terms of meeting pressing needs. So how can we do more for desperate people? By protecting the ability of help to get to them. I think it is immoral to prevent aid to reach people who desperately need it. On Gaza, we have already increased funding for Gaza this year in light of the very dramatically worsening conditions for people there. And I'm looking at my staff. We were actually discussing this before entry. The current figure. 31.6. So we are now at 31.6 million euros just from the humanitarian aid budget. And as you, I'm sure, are aware, the EU provides massive assistance to the Palestinian people through other instruments, not only through humanitarian aid. But we have already taken a step, and I can tell you that every day we think hard how we can stretch our funding more to help more people.
Okay. Christian? You'll be in French, I think.
Well, I'll try and speak slowly. My first question, I want to ensure I've understood for Iraq. You were saying we're moving to level 3, and I've just heard though we're moving to level 4 in through the translation. It's a technical point, but I just want to be absolutely sure what level we are at and where we're going. For public opinion reasons, what's the importance of that as well? As of the 5 million euros that have just been added, who are they going to go to? Public opinion tends to focus at the moment on the current crisis in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, where people are fleeing from dreadful conditions, from troop advances. They're taking refuge in the mountains. So is this 5 million euro aid for them, or will it be added to a general pot for all refugees in Iraq, which is not quite the same thing? My third question. Laurent Fabius, the French Foreign Affairs Minister, insists that a decision must be taken swiftly for an area bridge, and it's asking the EU to launch that in order to help these populations who have fled to the mountains and, as you've just said, cannot receive aid. I think that yesterday the parachuting from the British aid was interrupted to ensure that the packages didn't fall on people who were on the ground. I know you are a candidate for the head of diplomacy post. Do you think it's urgent to hold a very high-level meeting to take important decisions for these people who are facing such a critical situation? Thank you.
The level that is being discussed and in Geneva, as we speak, we might have a result by the time we walk out of this room, is to lift from level 2 to level 3. Level 3 is the highest level of humanitarian emergencies as classified by the United Nations. And it has significance because when an emergency is declared to be level 3, that leads to a very strong mobilization across the board in the United Nations to provide not only additional financial resources, but most importantly, more people, more hands to help in the areas that are declared level 3 emergencies. And as I said already, we now have 3 level 3 emergencies: Syria, South Sudan, and Central African Republic. And this used to be very unusual. It used to be that level 3 emergency would be rarely declared, and it would be 1, maximum 2. Since December last year, we are in this very strong pressure to help. Time we had in December the Philippines, you recall, and at that time we had 4 level 3 emergencies, and I guess the translation came from me saying 4 level 3 emergencies, and it got maybe translated as level 4 emergency. So today we are facing again a situation when we may have 4 level 3 emergencies, with the implication of drawing on people and capacity more strongly from across the humanitarian system of the United Nations. That is to say, not only UN OCHA, but also UNICEF, UNHCR, the other agencies that have emergency response capabilities. As for the assistance that we would provide to Iraq, the additional 5 million euros are in direct response of the most recent developments in Iraq. In other words, of the fact that from Sinjar province, probably up to 200,000 people have been displaced in horrible conditions. And this is aggravated by the fact that on the territory now controlled by the Islamic State, access for humanitarian workers is extremely limited, not to say basically impossible. ICRC, we are working with those organizations that have footprint in Iraq. Among them, ICRC has more than 100 delegates that are working, operating in areas of fighting. We are primarily aiming to help people once they reach a destination where access for humanitarian workers is possible, for understandable reasons. And as I mentioned, we are also aiming to help host communities, especially very poor host communities that find themselves overburdened by this flow of refugees. Why? Because it is morally right, but also because if we don't do it, there is always a risk that over time there may be some tension built up, making life of the displaced people even more difficult. We, as regard to how the European Commission can help more in terms of delivery, airdrops in places that have now become home of desperate, dehydrated, hungry, sometimes wounded people. One issue that we are discussing now is whether the United Nations or Iraq may turn to the European Commission for activating the so-called civil protection mechanism. This is the ability to mobilize in-kind assistance from member states and deliver it in coordinated manner, the coordination being done by my team here in the Emergency Response Coordination Center. We have not yet received such request, but we are already, in a sense, in foresight. We are thinking, should such requests arrive, then what could be the contribution we make? And obviously, I mean, just to give you one example, member states can call on us to co-finance transport costs of humanitarian operations. And that is very likely, if we are, should the mechanism be activated, very likely to be extremely helpful to those member states that have air lifting capabilities. Because we do not have, I mean, in the Commission we don't have assets of our own. What we have is the ability to make the collective operate in very efficient, well-coordinated manner, and to provide the financial means to ease an operation of that kind. Again, for example, in the recent floods in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia, we coordinated a very massive delivery of assistance through the civil protection mechanism that saved hundreds and hundreds of lives. We pulled thousands of people from roofs, the member states, but with the support, the coordination function that makes delivery of assistance so much more effective.
Follow-up?
Excusez-moi d'être...
Yes, I'm sorry to put it in pragmatic terms. We're talking about a lot of money, and I'd like to know whether the financial resources are already in the union's budget, because we know the financial perspective saw major cuts. We're talking about millions now. That's quite manageable. You say if ever the United Nations goes up to level 3 for Iraq, we're talking about hundreds of millions, even billions. Do we have that money? Are we prepared to ask the member states perhaps to contribute so that we can live up to these commitments? And when the Secretary General of the United Nations asked us, can we actually provide the money that's needed?
Well, in the case of Iraq, it is less a problem of money and much more a problem of access. Why? Because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has provided $500 million to the United Nations system to be able to help vulnerable Iraqis with humanitarian emergency assistance. Of course, we will have to step up to the plate from the rest of the world as conditions deteriorate further. In the European Commission, we have been fortunate to be supported by our member states, actually by our citizens, by the European people. And our budget has not been cut. On the contrary, there is a small increase in the funding for humanitarian aid. And we now have the coordinating platform of the civil protection mechanism with much stronger capabilities to deliver aid. Does that mean that we are not tight on the funding side? Of course not. As I explained, what we are facing over the last years is needs globally growing much faster than funding. Funding is increasing, but obviously not. What we see is not with the speed with which needs are increasing. In situations like this, Europe, time and again, has been able to come together and mobilize additional funding. And I think that it is very, we have done it for Syria. For Syria, we are by far the largest humanitarian donor, with now more than 1.8 billion euros in humanitarian assistance from member states and European Commission. We have done it by reprioritizing funding from other programs. So I am not excluding that in the next days we may have to come up to saying how we can do more. But I want to stress again, at this moment, funding is not the biggest worry we have. Our biggest worry is access. You know very well that airdropping is a last resort measure, because you can never be precise in helping everybody, each and every one that needs help. Always it is best if people can be reached where they are, and unfortunately the spread of extremism around the world, not just in Iraq, has meant more and more restrictions to access. The world is walking backwards on its main achievement after the 2 world wars, which was respect for humanity, even in the worst of circumstances. Let help get to those who need it. And we must reverse this trend for the sake of people who need our help, but also for our own sake. Because a world where humanity is eroded is not the world we want to live in.
Anne, I think, had the next question, and then we'll over here.
Oui, bonjour, Anne Boer, Les Échos.
Anne Boer from Les Échos. On Iraq, can you give us your feelings? Italy and France are calling for weapons to the Peshmerga Kurds and saying it has to be done straight away without any delay. So I'd like to know what your opinion of that is, even if that's not directly your own portfolio. On Ukraine, I didn't fully understand. You were talking about a decision for humanitarian aid of 2.5 million euros. Is that in the same convoy as the one we were discussing, organised by Russia and perhaps the Red Cross? Or is that for a future convoy? Things are a bit confused.
I'm so very grateful to you for asking for clarification if things are confused on your second question, and maybe I'll start from there. Russia's decision to provide humanitarian assistance is Russia's decision. The decision of the European Commission to increase, we actually have already funded relatively small amount through the Federation of the Red Cross humanitarian assistance for Ukraine. I probably should add, the very moment there was bloodshed in Ukraine, we set up a small humanitarian office in Ukraine, and our team has been in the eastern part and is working very closely with our humanitarian partners. The 2.5 million is to be delivered through our humanitarian partners in Ukraine in assistance to the affected population in the eastern part. But also what we want to do is to help Ukraine become more capable to cope with humanitarian issues. This is not an area where they have had experience. There has been quite some time of putting together a humanitarian law. And that is, we believe that we, as part of our support for Ukraine to have stronger institutions, we would like to help them to have stronger capability to cope with humanitarian issues. On Iraq, the question you're asking indeed is not in my sphere of competence, but what I can say is that it is a responsibility to member states. This is for member states to decide, and you're very well aware that member states are discussing this issue, and whatever decision they take and implement, this is not the competence of the Commission to deal with.
Next question we'll see from the lady in white. Yeah.
Hi there, Sandra Gatman from Rudao TV in Erbil. I have two questions. What aid specifically, if any, has been given to the Kurdish people? Obviously, as you mentioned, they're suffering a quite critical refugee crisis. And secondly, obviously not your competence, but would you welcome military assistance, as is being proposed by countries like France and others, in protecting those avenues in the delivery of aid that you say are so important? Thanks.
The humanitarian assistance from the Commission to Iraq is actually a long-lasting. We have been helping with Iraqi refugees in the neighboring countries for a long time. We have been helping with internal displacements in Iraq for a long time. But what has happened in the last 18 months is that two factors have pressed us to focus more on Iraq. The first one was the Syrian refugees crossing the river into the Tigris River into the Kurdish region of Iraq. They are now in the order of 220, 230,000 people. And actually, I went in March to Iraq mostly because the world has not been paying enough attention to the generosity of the Kurdish people in receiving refugees and actually treating them very graciously, very well. But then I recognized at that time, in March, that there was a second driver that needed us to be much more focused on Iraq. And at that time, actually, I wrote to our foreign affairs ministers when I came back. And the driver was sectarian violence, Sunni-Shia fight. It was initially mostly Anbar province problem. There were about 350,000 refugees from internal displacement from Anbar province, and very little international attention to what was going on. And unfortunately, with the spillover from Syria into Iraq of ISIS, ISIL, IS, with the most recent treatment, what has happened is that the humanitarian crisis there just exploded. So what we do, as I mentioned, at that point in March, when I was in Erbil, I talked to the government to establish a humanitarian office because my sense was that there would be dual pressure, no end of the war, no end in sight of the war in Syria, and unfortunately more trouble inside Iraq. And the government there was very welcoming. And that office is now directing our program vis-a-vis internal displacement in Iraq. Our primary partner is ICRC. Why? Because of their very broad footprint in Iraq, in the zones of fighting, especially before the most recent events. They were actually bravely present in very dangerous conditions. We are also providing assistance through other organizations that are present in the Kurdish part of Iraq and that have very good capacity to deliver assistance. Among them, the Danish Refugee Council, Save the Children, and I'm looking at my team. UNICEF as well, and Norwegian Refugee Council. So that's the one I was missing. What we do is very strictly focusing on the most vulnerable of the internal displaced people, and we provide them emergency assistance including food, shelter, and non-food items. When you leave your home with nothing but the clothes on your back, you need very basic things, soap, some medical supplies just to be able to survive. And we also are helping communities, local host communities. And again, we are guided by severity of the needs. Now with new arrivals, clearly needs are growing very, very rapidly. And this is why my presence here today and today's announcement.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Yes. I think one more question from the lady here in white, and then we have to...
Does it work? Okay. Megan Lee, Deutsche Welle Television. With the United States taking the military lead in Iraq, is Washington putting pressure on the EU to do more or to step up to the plate, as you said?
And actually, I'm sorry I didn't answer the second half of your question. I apologize. It is not in my mandate. And you're asking me what is my opinion, should there be more? I mean, my view is that we face in the world, we face a very dangerous increase of extremism. And that combined with extreme weather, with climate change, is creating tremendous suffering of magnitudes not known since the big wars here in Europe. Just one comparison. This year, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees presented a report showing that we have crossed 51 million refugees and internally displaced people, more than what has been the displacement impact of the Second World War, more. And again, in 1 year, this number has grown by 6 million. 6 million, this is the whole island of Ireland displaced in 1 year. Just imagine the proportion. So, and what are the drivers of these displacements? Extremism, fighting, conflicts, climate change. So, as humanitarian commissioner, I fully understand that humanitarian aid only can go that far. It's like plaster on a wound. There has to be much stronger engagement with other instruments, political means, with investment in conflict prevention, conflict resolution, resilience to climate change. That is not from the pockets of humanitarians. We can put some seed money, but we cannot resolve it. And of course, there is a role when there is fighting. There is a role for the military, but it's not for us to judge when, how, by whom. That is not our job. And actually, if we step into this territory, we are hurting humanitarians, because then we become party of a political discussion. And with this, I would turn to you. It is actually counterproductive to humanitarians doing our job to venture out of what is our mandate. As tough as it is, we have to stick with it.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
I understand that's all we have time for.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for actually being in such a big number in the middle of the summer. I take it to be a very good indication of your attention to how we can best help from the EU. Thank you.
So with that, we turn to any further questions you might have. This is a midday briefing. Madam Georgieva stayed with us for a very long time. We're grateful for that. We're, of course, open to any questions you might have on other subjects. So.
I have a question on Iraq.